Hi, welcome back. This is part 2 of week 2, module 2 of ARS 202, and we're turning now to the Eastern Woodlands in our quick survey of Indigenous art in North America. So this is the Eastern Woodlands. You can see across that same map we were looking at in the last video, there's a much larger area here around the Great Lakes, but extending substantially south into what is now the Carolinas, for example. The Iroquois story of creation tells of Sky Woman, who was pushed from the land of the Sky People through a hole opened up by the uprooting of the great tree of light. She was born on the wings of birds. They sort of caught her, I guess, and took her to a safe landing on the back of a great turtle. That great turtle would become the world, the land that we all live on. North America is also called Turtle Island. The story tells also of how Muskrat brought up a clod of earth from beneath the waters, and that clod expanded as the muskrat walked around until it became the earth we know. The story tells also of the birth of a daughter to Sky Woman, and how Sky Woman's daughter became the mother of twins. One of those twins is named Good Mind. Good Mind created human beings and all the things that would be useful to human beings. But at every step, Good Mind had to counter the actions of his twin, Bad Mind. Bad Mind went about unleashing negative and destructive things. In this story, the existence of evil is in part explained by an initial act of going against nature. A Seneca elder named Jesse Cornplanter tells the story of how Sky Woman's daughter, before the twins were born, Good Mind and Bad Mind, the twins, before the twins were born, she heard them talking while they were still within her body. And one was talking about how they should come out from the quickest way out of the mother's body, and the other one was saying, no, we should come out the normal way. So what happened was, after a while, one twin, Good Mind, was born in the usual way that humans are born, whereas the other came out of her armpit, in the process, killing their mother. So there's, I don't say a duality here, but there is the intertwining of good and bad, as we see in the importance of good and bad ways of thinking in relation to the world. So let's think about the Eastern cultures. Archaeologists date the first occupancy of Eastern North America to big game hunters living in the region from around 14,000 to about 10,000 years ago. That very ancient phase was followed by an era we call the Archaic, which lasted till about 1000 BCE, which was a long period. And during that time, folks lived by hunting and gathering and began to develop many of the characteristic spiritual practices, traces of which we still maintain today. This Archaic period is also the period when we find the first traces of what we call art. This is also that moment, the Archaic period, is the beginning of a 5,000-year-long tradition of building large-scale earthworks, of shaping the ground and the land into these particular patterns for important cultural reasons, as burial sites, ceremonial centers, etc. This is the somewhat well-known Serpent Mound in southern Ohio. And you can see it's a much later date here. This is about the year 1000. That early art that I was just talking about looks something like this sometimes. This is a stone figure, carved out of stone, and it's a pipe. You know, the bowl of the pipe is on top there, and it's in the shape of a human. But you notice the human is wearing these earplugs, right? Not within the ear canal, but in the lobe of the ear, right? These ear spools. You recognize these as something people wear today, but they're very recognizably connected to Mesoamerican culture from much further south, southern Mexico into Central America, right? And so the part of the point here is this particular kind of early woodlands culture, what we can call the Hopewell culture here, they were not isolated, right? They participated in this vast network of exchange, which stretched from Ontario and Canada down to Florida, okay? So copper from the Great Lakes, shell, from shellfish from the Gulf Coast, teeth from grizzly bears in the Rocky Mountains, etc., right? Alligator teeth from Florida. All of this can be found up there around the Great Lakes as part of this. There's a part of this very large series of exchange networks. Now, you remember how I talked about last module, Annalee Newitz's book, For Lost Cities, and her argument that, cultures don't really die, they just change shape. That is sort of what we can say here about this ancient Hopewell culture and its subsequent life, I guess you would call it. What I'm trying to say is, you find there was a period when they're building lots of these mounds, lots of these earthworks, and then they stop. And so it's not that the culture disappears, right? Those cosmological principles, those spiritual beliefs of those ancient peoples continue to inform later cultures. And so the traces of that ancient Hopewell culture are everywhere to be seen throughout the woodlands. Some of which I want to highlight for you here. So I'm trying to highlight the continuity and the particular media that we can recognize up until even to the present, like going back thousands of years here, this tradition. So here on the right is the particular object that I'm especially interested in. This is a war club, and you can see the kind of, okay, it's a war club, but what I have on the right is a pretty crappy image. That's why I've picked one off the internets. Here on the left, a much clearer image, which you can hopefully get a sense of, and how you can see how this is carved in this on the left out of wood. It's got a ball carved into it, and it's got this long handle, and obviously it's a kind of mace. It's a kind of weapon. You use it to, hurt people with. The one on the right, though, is not an actual weapon. It is a ceremonial weapon. It would have been used in ceremonies rather than on the battlefield. How do we know? A couple of things. First of all, on the one on the right, you can see how in the ball there's these little white dots, right? These little white pale discs. These are little discs of shell, right? So made from the shellfish coming from the Gulf Coast, for example. These brightly colored, almost white, precious objects, which are here inlaid into this ball, the ball of this club. I mean, it's not really the kind of thing that's going to be useful on a battlefield, right? So that tells us this is probably a ceremonial club. Combine that with the fact that the handle, at the very end of the handle, is the head of a bear. If you look at the shape of the handle, if you were to tip the whole thing up like this, you'd see the head of the bear facing upright. Right now, the bear's head is down. The top of it's down here. The part up a little bit further up is the base of the chin, right? That would be a spirit bear. It's a spirit animal, which tells us, again, this is probably a ceremonial object and not a real weapon for war. But what I'm getting at is those shells, those pieces of shell. This is the same symbolic language of materials. These, white shells, these shiny shells, for example, but also metal, red stone, there are other objects, other types of materials. This comes down from the ancient Adena and Hopewell. Right? We see those things in the ancient Adena and Hopewell cultures 1,000, 3,000 years ago or more, right? And so here we are with this war club from the 17th or 18th century. We're talking like 3,000 years immediately of continuity of the symbolic power of materials, right? This is remarkable continuity in these cultures. So let me riff on that. We're talking about the value, the spiritual value of certain kinds of materials. Like these shiny bits of shell, which are, of course, fragile, rare, etc. So there's a scholar named George Hamel, actually. He talked about how early contact, trade between indigenous folks and settlers. So we can go back to, what, the 17th century in the East? And you think about early settlers. Personally, I'm thinking of Jacques Cartier arriving in what is now Quebec City in Montreal in 16-something. And so you're encountering, these explorers and settlers are encountering powerful indigenous societies, and they're trading objects. But what the scholar Hamel says is that, it was not really a trade in precious things. They weren't just trading, hey, this metal is really useful, let me go make a tool out of this metal. They weren't just trading precious stuff, they were trading metaphors. They're trading objects that have value culturally, not materially, in that sense. It's not a kind of economic rationale. The Europeans might have thought, hey, this stuff is valuable. We'll give them something valuable. They give us something valuable, right? But the indigenous people were not looking for material value, but they were thinking of spiritual value and aesthetic value, which is deeply tied to this. So the European, so the indigenous people were especially interested in getting things that would be like medicine substances, with life-giving healing properties, these mirrors, right, that reflect, glass beads, silver, various kinds of metals that have these properties, this sort of brightness, whiteness, reflectiveness, etc. These are the kinds of materials that are part of this long tradition of valuing things like that goes all the way back to Adena and Hopewell. And so these had, for the woodlands folks, the indigenous folks, strong moral associations of self-knowledge, introspection, and understanding. Right? Again, it's not about economic transactions so much as it is about acquiring sort of culturally and personally important materials. We can connect this long tradition to what we saw in the documentary last week about the Haudenosaunee and the wampum belt that is so important to them. As you know, wampum is a material that's made out of shells. And honestly, I don't fully understand the process of making it, but it's a very fragile material and it's very hard to make. So you have a wampum belt like this made with, I don't even know how many pieces that is. That's like, what, thousands of pieces? This must have been many, many, many hours of work just to make all these pieces, right? And you may recall what some of the indigenous folks were trying to teach, the elders were teaching the children in the documentary about, like, okay, be careful, go slowly, right? Yes, each individual piece is really quite fragile, but when you get it all put together, they support each other, right? Think about that as a metaphor for people. But what I'm getting at is, here you have shell, this translucent, reflective, white shell, the same kind of material, right, that was valued all the way back many thousands of years ago with the Adena and Hopewell cultures. Here being a powerful, important material carefully and laboriously put together to commemorate and reiterate the importance of a political alliance, of the coming together of these 5, now 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and the importance of that story for who they are and their values. Right? So one reason to think about the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, is that they were in many ways the most recent of a series of powerful political confederacies and chiefdoms that arose and continued in the eastern half of North America over the past 2,000 years. They go back a few hundred years, but they weren't the first, is what I'm saying. And once again, there are stereotypes. There are persistent stereotypes that come down to us, the sort of lone, let me highlight something here. I'm going to use outdated and perhaps slightly problematic language, but I want to use it ironically as a way of making fun of outdated ideas. So there are stereotypes of the Indian brave, the lone hunter there, struggling against nature, etc. It comes to us from novels like by James Fenimore Cooper, right? Last of the Mohicans and things like this, very popular novels at one point, but it creates an image that persisted. The thing is, it's a completely wrong stereotype. Those images highlight the individual, that lone individual, but in fact, Eastern Woodlands people, by and large, lived in large, settled, agricultural communities with sophisticated political systems. And we can get a bit of sense of that when we think about the Haudenosaunee and how they, as 5 nations, now 6, came together in a political alliance, which is not just about commemorating his ancient events, but it's about thinking through and elaborating the political ideals and the ethical values of the sort of peacemaker who ended the war and brought those nations together and divided power amongst them. Right? And we know that there is evidence that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy inspired the American Founding Fathers. Because think about it, right? when, you know, Ben Franklin and all the rest of them were trying to figure out, like, okay, we're going to have a country now. What kind of government do we want? I mean, how many examples of democracy in the world did they have to go on? I'll tell you, none, right? There were ancient examples, going back to ancient Rome, which is why, of course, that ancient Rome and ancient Greece, that why, of course, the buildings in Washington, D.C., the fancy government buildings tend to be white and classical, right? It's a callback to that stuff. And what am I getting at here? Sorry, maybe I'm just losing my train of thought talking too long here. But I'm trying to highlight, here in the United States, right, we venerate the Founding Fathers, possibly too much. But there's a long, not only a long political tradition, but there's a lot of people who still make livelihoods trying to think through and re-enunciate the political ideals developed by the Founding Fathers, right? Or develop new political ways of dealing with our current world based on these old traditions. There's a sophisticated political tradition that is uniquely American, coming out of the American Revolution, right? You probably already know that. What I'm trying to say is, it's just like this with the Haudenosaunee, right? Sophisticated political tradition involving principles of government, involving ethics, involving ideas of correct behavior, etc., involving how to envision a whole society, is embodied in this via the figure of the wampum, the Hiawatha belt. So let me go back to my notes here. One of the things that is maybe worth thinking about here is that, as you know, the process of making wampum and the process of making a wampum belt like this is really time-consuming and laborious. But there's something here that is also worth paying attention to, which is to say, for a lot of indigenous cultures, including perhaps the Haudenosaunee here, what matters is not just the finished object. What matters is also the process. That the process itself can be just as important, if not sometimes more important, than the finished thing itself. Right? And the honoring of the political confederacy, of the political coming together, and the sophisticated political tradition that I just tried to highlight for you, is done not just by having the wampum belt and whipping it out at certain times, but in the whole process of making it, as well as retelling the stories and recommitting to those traditions and to those ideas. To this day, wampum belts are still used in this fashion. And when it comes to like land claims and political disputes, like in courts of law, there are indigenous communities that have brought out the wampum belts and said, look, here is the evidence, here is the proof of the agreement and the treaty that we signed that gives us the rights to such and such land, etc., blah, blah, blah. Okay? So even in the 20th century, you've got the meanings of the wampum belts and the political events that they commemorate and reiterate, brought up even in Anglo-American courts of law. I'm using this example here that you've already seen as a stand-in for the sophisticated kinds of clothing and the highly decorated clothing that folks from the Eastern Woodlands, the various nations in the Eastern Woodlands, were known to have worn. Early settlers, 18th century travelers, right, almost to a man, and they nearly always are men, almost to a man, describe how, all the way from the Carolinas up to the Ohio River and the Great Lakes, how the indigenous people were so well dressed, right? Really rich and sophisticated forms of garments that really impressed these Europeans. We have lots of descriptions of these things. What that tells us, or what that highlights for us, is that clothing and body decoration were very culturally important ways that an individual would communicate to everyone else who they were, but also the powers and the rights that that individual had that they would have acquired from a guardian spirit. There's this tradition called the Vision Quest that both men and women participated in. This is an indigenous practice. And it's a rite that begins at puberty. And I won't get into it, partly because I'd probably do a bad job of trying to explain it. But but what you've got is various visions that people have that help them figure out who they are, who they want to be, and connects people to various spirit animals and other kinds of figures. So we have this bag here, which shows us Thunderbird. Thunderbird is a powerful spirit animal, kind of mythological animal. And the person who would have worn this belt, well, this would have been a powerful symbol of who they were that they acquired in their vision quest. And so you have a kind of individual identity as well as a larger group identity being communicated via the imagery on the clothing and the accessories like your bag here. So there's all kinds of visual forms of visual expression in terms of body painting, elaborate tattoos, right, carving, embroidery, painted decoration, etc. on all kinds of things that you would own would all have this kind of imagery and thus be very impressive to European observers. I talked before about quill work. That last bag I just flashed at you once again used porcupine quill, as you may recall. Well, here are some diagrams of quill work that I got out of a textbook. Again, sorry for the really bad reproduction here. I got to dig my books out of storage and rescan this image. But this is a diagram that shows you a few different ways in which porcupine quills would be sewn into a garment or woven together to, cover an area or to create different kinds of colored patterns when you weave together different colors of porcupine quills. And part of what I like about this diagram is it shows not just the techniques of how they applied the porcupine quills, but it also shows you how the beads, which you see at the bottom two rows there, are glass beads, which are of course a trade good made in European factories, traded to indigenous people, and the indigenous people are like, we have to have this stuff. And the beads quickly come to supplement and perhaps even replace quill work in indigenous embroidery. So you can see the patterns here, the techniques of how they put the beads on. And again, I want to reiterate how the aesthetics of the beads goes back thousands of years in terms of bright, light, shiny, etc., and thus having spiritual power. Let me talk about adaptation via a particular kind of bag. We'll use the example of bandolier bags. We'll trace the process of how bandolier bags became adapted in this period of contact and early settlement, and thus tremendous transformation in North American culture. So the earliest kinds of bags that we know of would have been these kind of rectangular bags. Some of them would have been made out of hide, like buffalo hide or something like that. Others were woven. This one here is what we call a twined bag, and it's done through a kind of process that was called finger weaving or something. I don't actually, to be honest with you, I don't fully understand, but it's a kind of woven or even knitted kind of bag. And you can see it's rectangular. This particular one, we think, would have held not just food or other kinds of useful things, because, bags are useful to carry your stuff. This one in particular probably would have held medicinal substance, a medicine bundle, powerful spiritual objects. How do we know? From the imagery. Because if you look at the pattern there, right, it's a kind of abstract imagery. At the bottom, we see part of a mythological animal. What we see there is Mishipeshu, pardon my pronunciation, please, a figure, a spirit animal called the underwater panther. Panther, like a large cat, right? Think of like a mountain lion. But this underwater panther, we see the lower part of its body, and I think we see the four legs there. The tail of the panther, the tail of the Mishipeshu, is what causes the waves in the Great Lakes. Let me stop here for a second and go off on a slight tangent. I didn't really grow up near the Great Lakes as such. It didn't feel that way. We were a couple hours drive from the Great Lakes, and my parents didn't go on, road trips in the car. It was not really their culture. But my wife is from Southern Ontario, and the Great Lakes are like her playground. She has been to all kinds of them. And I remember what it was like the first time I saw one of the Great Lakes. It was Lake Huron, actually. And I remember going there, and I'm like, oh my God, why can't I see the other side of this lake? Right. They're huge. It's like feeling like you're on the edge of the world. Right. So we're there. It's southern Ontario. I'm looking at Lake Huron. Michigan's on the other side. Can't see it. And the Great Lakes also have waves. Right. You know, not just small things, but big waves sometimes that can capsize boats. Right. All I'm getting at is the Great Lakes are freaking immense and kind of scary sometimes. So think about being in the ocean in a small boat, in a canoe. Think about being in a giant lake with waves that can capsize you and you can drown there. It can also be pretty scary. So the waves in the Great Lakes, Lake Huron, which are powerful and can be scary, these are caused by Mishipeshu, the underwater panther, waving its tail back and forth. And you can see that in the upper part of this image. So the lower part, again, we see the four legs of the panther. Up above that, we see these lines, these what are called lines of power. But they also symbolize the waves of the Great Lakes. And it is precisely because of this reference to spiritual power coming from a spirit animal that we think this bag was for medicine substances. Now, this is one of the early kinds of bags, but very quickly, in the contact period, indigenous people appropriate something they see that Europeans, Euro-American settlers, are wearing, and that's called a bandolier. Right? There's the bag with a strap that you throw over your shoulder. That first bag I just showed you would have been tied to your belt, right, and hang off your waist. This is a kind of bag with a shoulder strap that you throw across your body. And that was something that they got from Europeans. But we see here, this is a hide bag made of deer skin. It's got moose hair tufts on it, and you can see porcupine quills. And again, this is a particular one that communicates the thunderbird, which would have been important to the person who owned it, and perhaps also references the spiritual power maybe of what was kept inside of it. So here you have a very clear example of this appropriation of Euro-American kind of clothing. Well, not long after that, you find glass beads becoming adopted, and then the patterns change. Now, it's partly because you can do more complicated curves with glass beads, whereas the porcupine quills tend to make a kind of blocky, pixelated kind of image. I'm an old man, but I think about the ways in which some of the graphic computer design aesthetics, like on some video games, are kind of not low poly graphic imagery in video games, but the kind of pixelated 8-bit, original Nintendo kind of imagery. It's a bit like that. These sort of little blocky images is what you can more easily make with porcupine quills, as you can see on the strap of the bandolier there. Well, on the right, you can see the more curved patterns that are easier to make with beads. So the beads become more available. But here's the thing. It's not just that the materials change, it's the imagery changes. And the imagery changes, again, because of appropriation and adaptation. So let me paraphrase a little bit from an early Canadian an early Canadian settler. So in the history of Canadian literature, there are some early books written by settlers from the early 19th or mid-19th century. One of these is called Roughing It in the Bush, right, by Susanna Moodie. Well, it's Susanna Moodie's sister also wrote books. Her name was Catherine Parr Traill. And Catherine Parr Traill wrote in one of her books about how in the 1830s, she had a particular series of encounters with some indigenous people who lived nearby. And so she described how there were Ojibwe women in a nearby community. And one of those Ojibwe women, absolutely fell in love with the floral patterns and designs on Catherine Parr Traill's husband's dressing gown. So Catherine Parr Traill, her husband, had a dressing gown with this brightly colored, patterned chintz material, and this Ojibwe woman's like, oh my God, I love that. And Catherine Parr Traill's like, nope, I'm not going to give you this garment. We're keeping the garment, but we like that you appreciate it. Thank you very much. But apparently, all the women in the wigwam, I'm paraphrasing here, all the women in the wigwam came they took turns coming over to look at the dressing gown because they just were fascinated by the patterning. And so what I'm highlighting is the floral, damn it, there I go again. So what I'm highlighting is the adoption of floral patterns. Well, where did the floral patterns come from? They came from Euro-American settlers. It's important to remember here that for the Victorians, so the English Victorians, with this Euro-American culture of theirs, flowers were not meaningless. Like to us today, flowers are like pretty decoration, I guess. But for them, they were deeply meaningful because they were seen as the epitome of God's beauty, the beauty of God's creation and the natural world. And simultaneously, flowers represented the essence of refinement and femininity. Right? They were very appropriate for women, and they sort of symbolized appropriate womanliness. So you would have Christian missionaries teaching indigenous people needlework, teaching them various crafts and skills, perhaps to make a living and things like that. You can easily imagine how these Christian missionaries would teach these indigenous women flower patterns, right? And it would have seemed to the missionaries like, oh, look, they're assimilating. They're becoming like good little white people. Yay, we've done our job. When in fact, you have another kind of appropriation here. It's true that representations of flowers and vegetation really had not been all that prominent, really wasn't a thing in indigenous textiles beforehand. However, vegetation and flowers and plants are important in indigenous belief systems and spiritual systems. They're an essential part of the process of creation. There were all kinds of plants that are used as healing medicines. And some other plants, like berries, are really important foods as ritual foods that symbolize seasonal renewal, right? The renewal of the seasons every year. And so you've got indigenous people adapting their stories, their belief, well, adapting their imagery to pick up on other parts of their beliefs that didn't used to be visually depicted, so that these floral patterns and imagery could have a kind of double significance, right? This is where I meant to be after all. To Euro-Americans, to settlers who are trying to forcibly assimilate the natives, they'd be like, oh yes, look, they're being good little natives. They're doing the white people culture in the right way. But for indigenous people, it was a different kind of reassertion of key aspects of their culture. So a kind of like double message. So many of the things that were made in beadwork in the 19th century and in the early 20th were not made for native people. They were sold as souvenirs, like I think I described here already. I know I showed you this image here. I can't exactly remember everything I said about it. But what you got is a couple of things. You've got this tremendous creativity on the part of indigenous women, because remember, beadwork and quillwork is women's art. Okay? And you've got the beadwork and quillwork being elaborated in all kinds of ways by these really creative, inventive indigenous women. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, this is the 19th century. This is the later 19th century. So you've got industrially produced beads and other textiles vastly more available than perhaps earlier in human history. So you've got lots more stuff to work with. It's a lot easier to get stuff to make textiles and beadwork out of. But also, it becomes a way to make a living. You have to think about this period of forced assimilation, and you think about the poverty and economic deprivation that indigenous people suffered through because their traditional livelihoods were taken away. Right? Their land was stolen from them, the land was taken from them. And they couldn't rely on hunting and gathering and other kinds of agriculture for their own living in the way that they used to. It left them dependent in many ways on foods provided via treaties. Right? I'm thinking of how on the Yellow Dig course site, a couple of folks were talking about some things that they had experienced in their lives, and somebody brought up fry bread. right? So Native American fry bread is traditional Native American food today, but it really only comes from kind of the 19th century, when folks, indigenous people, were forced onto reservations where they didn't live before. It was not their traditional land. They didn't know the land. They didn't know how to farm it. They didn't know how to gather the foods there. And also, they were forced onto that land probably because it wasn't good farmland. The settlers wanted to take the good farmland from themselves, force the indigenous people onto bad farmland that nobody wanted. Right? And so they ended up being given flour and other kinds of substances as part of the treaty, saying, all right, well, we're taking away your hunting grounds, but we'll give you something to eat. And that's how fry bread comes into it. So what I'm saying is people are suffering. So they had to turn to other economic patterns to make a living. And using their traditional tools, the traditional techniques of quill work, adapted now to beadwork, they were able to make, some folks were able to make a surprisingly good living. So between the 1830s and the 1930s, this is the development of also a period of travel and tourism. Modern tourism becomes a thing. It becomes invented. And so you have, well, as I record this, the Pinal County Fair is still ongoing. I think maybe today's the last day. Okay. Pinal County is just south of Maricopa County. Maricopa County is where Phoenix is, right? Pinal County is just south of that, so the Pinal County Fair is on. And it's a state fair. It's a county fair, right? There are county fairs, there are state fairs. I've been to the Minnesota State Fair. It's huge. There's all kinds of things like this. What I'm saying is people go to this stuff, including back then, in between the 1830s and the 1930s, indigenous women would go and they would sell their handiworks. They would sell their crafts as souvenirs to white people. And they would go from county fair to county fair, state fair to state fair, right? Hop on the train, travel all around the eastern part of North America, selling this stuff. Niagara Falls was a major location for this. And this becomes a process of economic survival, in part. Let me show you a couple of passages from a book where I got some of this stuff from, by an amazing scholar. I remember I told you about a couple of classes I took, what feel like a lifetime ago, that just opened my eyes to indigenous art and culture. This is by that professor who I took those classes with. She was writing this book while I was taking her classes. And so right here, let's zoom in on this page, and we can see how there's an Indian agent in 1882. The Indian agents are figures from the federal government, either Canadian federal government or the American federal government, who are basically in charge of forced assimilation. And so the Indian agent in Akwesasne, or the St. Regis Reservation, complained that, hey, they're not being farmed. We're trying to make them farmers, damn it. Good capitalist farmers. None of this business of like having land that's owned collectively by the whole tribe. No, we want individual private property, good capitalists, right? Farmers, damn it. And they're not doing it. They want to make baskets and make axe handles and do beadwork and make moccasins and sell all that stuff, right, to feed themselves here. And they travel all over the place, and damn it, this leads to bad moral results, you see, because they're not being good farmers. And we see this, and Professor Phillips here talks about how the same complaint reappears again and again in the last quarter of the 19th century, right? So so somebody else was saying about the Maliseet at Woodstock, Woodstock, Ontario, I think it was, or maybe it was Woodstock, New York, sorry. Like most of the Indians, Woodstock, New Brunswick. Like most of the Indians of New Brunswick, they prefer the sale of a basket to farming, right? And so she points out here, both assimilationist policy and Aboriginal resistance that brought an end to assimilationist policy, both of these things can be found if you read between the lines of these statements. Let me go to continue down the page here. So Indian agents had to admit, sometimes grudgingly, that, actually they could make a pretty good living doing some of this stuff, right? At Lorat Wendick in Quebec, near Quebec City, wrote in 1885 that the Huron Wendat engage more in manufacturing snowshoes, moccasins, lacrosse sticks than in hunting or agriculture, and they can secure sufficiency for their families, and some of them are quite well off. And at the bottom of this, what I'm showing you here, there's a bit that continues on past the bottom of the screen that I'll just summarize for you. So an English-speaking visitor named Marianne Finch, she went to Kanawage, and she admired the comfortable white-painted houses that the people were able to make lots of money, like $7,000 a year, on top of the money that they used to pay for the house. That was a lot of money back then. I'm just mentioning Kanawage here. Last year, 6 months ago, I was living literally right next to Kanawage. It's in the Montreal area, right, just south of on the other side of the river, just south of Montreal, and it's the Ganawage Mohawk Reservation, and I was literally 2 minutes drive right from there. I'm going to end this section here before we turn to the plains, just by highlighting something that I really love about this image and Professor Phillips' description of this image here. This is the St. Regis Indian Show Company. If I remember correctly, the St. Regis Reservation is in New York State. It's on the other side of the border, but it's part of the same Iroquois territory that got carved up between the different countries. And they're traveling to Lawrence, Kansas. Think about that. That's a long way away, huh? From upstate New York. Well, it feels like anyway. And this is 1894. This is the members of this traveling Indian show company were Black Eagle, Jake Paul, Marianne Black Eagle, Chief Running Deer, Philip Big Tree, and Lily Deer. What I want to highlight is the woman standing second from the left. I don't actually know her name. I don't know if she's Marianne Black Eagle or if she is Lily Deer. Sorry about that. You'll notice a couple of things. Notice what she's wearing. She's wearing a little crown, kind of a little headdress there, a crown. And that crown, it's a kind of Euro-American style crown. This is a total stereotype. She is meant to play the Indian princess, right? Part of the kind of figure that shows up in so many stereotype stories that settler colonial people told about indigenous folks. If I remember correctly, is it not the case that the figure of Pocahontas, even she, in part of the whole story, maybe even the Disney movie, is an Indian princess in the same way? That whole story of Pocahontas follows that same pattern. So this lady here, this indigenous lady, is wearing the crown for the white people. It's a total stereotype of what the white settler audience will expect. But at the very same time, she's wearing on her dress, on her skirt perhaps, she's wearing a tree of life, an embroidered tree of life. I can't tell from here if that's beadwork. I'm going to guess there's a bunch of beadwork probably involved there. But you've got that embroidery, that beadwork, and it shows the symbol of the tree of life. We've seen the tree of life. It's in that painting by Blake de Basseguy that he combined with the crucifixion, the figure of Jesus, right? This is an important symbol in Iroquois cosmology. So at the very same time as you got these indigenous folks who are just, in a sense, reduced to this, performing stereotyped versions of Indianness for a bunch of white folks who don't even know the first thing about it, and traveling all over to do it. At the very same time as you might think, oh boy, right, for these, this powerful nation, now reduced to this. Still, at the same time, this is a place where they can reassert and reperform some of the old traditions. Yeah, they're doing it for a bunch of white tourists, but they're still doing it. And so you've got, remember I talked a few minutes ago about the floral patterns, and how the floral patterns meant one thing to the white folks and a different thing to the indigenous folks, right? There's a kind of double signification happening simultaneously. Not quite coded, but here you've got this Mohawk, or at least Iroquois woman, wearing the tree of life. It's a symbol that indigenous people would recognize, even if the white folks wouldn't even notice it. So you've got a kind of double signification going on right here. My point is this a kind of tragic picture of indigenous people reduced to performing stereotype versions of their culture? Or is this also an image of resilience and the reassertion and continuation of indigenous tradition? The answer is yes. It's not either or. It's both and at the same time. So with that, let us turn to the last section of our material for this week. And we're going to talk about the plains people, or the various nations on the plains. In the Lakota way of thinking about the world, the Lakota cosmology, there's a kind of key phrase. They say, taku skan skan. Please forgive my pronunciation. And apparently it translates rather badly into English. And in English we might say, something that moves, moves. And this phrase encapsulates the idea that the entire universe is in motion. The entire universe is in motion and infused with power and mystery. Life was created out of the primal rock that squeezed from within itself its own blue blood, that became the water that covers the earth and also became the sky. And from this developed the differentiation of the earth and sky and sun and moon. And the ordering of the world was not completed, by the way, until the four winds, who are represented in Lakota tradition as four young brothers. The four winds established the four cardinal directions in north, south, east, west, as well as divided the times of day into day and night, and divided the year into a cycle of lunar months and seasons. So when I say plains, I'm referring to this large area of North America, as you can see further west of the woodlands and dipping further south. One of the things to start with is by highlighting how folks on the plains were not isolated either. They were part of vast trading networks, right? So this is just an example of a carved piece of shell that would be worn around the neck, so what we call a gorget. You'd sort of hang it off of a couple of sinews around your neck there. And these are shells from, say, the Gulf of Mexico, found as far as Manitoba. So think of where North Dakota is, right? So, you know, like where South Dakota, North Dakota, find North Dakota on a map, go north, right? So from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Manitoba, there you find shells from California, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, right? Along with evidence of intellectual and artistic transmissions. These vast trading networks that span the continent. So I've already shown you this image. But what I do want to highlight is the importance of the buffalo, right? The buffalo is what provided people on the plains, at least for a time, not only with food, but canvas that they could make paintings of, which we'll see, which we'll look at. You can make shields, both physical shields that will protect you, but also spiritual shields that were important ceremonially. You'd make shelter, you'd make teepees, which are a kind of tent that could be folded up and dragged behind your horses, and also clothing, right? So the buffalo could be used for all of this stuff. What I want to highlight is this fact that this is this image here represents, perhaps to those of us who are Euro-American settler heritage, it represents a kind of image that is so recognizable. It is perhaps the Ur stereotype, the kind of almost basic stereotype of all indigenous people, right? Around the world, I mean. Right? I was just Googling a few minutes ago, trying to find some of these old French language comic books published in Belgium that I read as a kid, sometimes in French, sometimes in English. And these were old when I was young. And the stereotype of indigenous people in them was exactly this, right? The Indian brave, I'm using this language rather flippantly to try and subvert stereotypical ideas, right? So that Indian brave, the great warrior, with his feathered headdress on horseback with teepees nearby as part of their settlement. This is what people around the world recognize. But the thing is, this was a way of life that only existed for not even 200 years. Out of the many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years that humans existed in the middle and the plains of North America, this was only a brief fragment of that time, maybe about 1700 to about 1870. What's worth paying attention to is less the image of the warrior that we so easily think about, and more about, we can think more instead about the different arts that are done by men and women, because there's a gender divide here. Some arts are appropriate for the men, some of the arts are women's arts, and men should not do them. And complex intellectual underpinnings of indigenous art and life, some of which we'll talk about today. So, there are various phrases in a whole range of plains languages that you find in indigenous nations on the plains. And these phrases tend to describe, there's kind of commonalities what I'm getting at. A commonality that describes how people were to dress yourself and adorn yourself, quote, in proper relationship to the gods. Right? And so it's important. It's important that you not only look good, it's important that you dress in the correct ways that are part of this connection of the human to nature and the spirit world. Right? So that we dress in the right way, in ways that honor our relationship to the gods. Sometimes, when it came to really important sacred garments, the indigenous people would say, something sacred wears me. Not the other way around. Like we would say, I am wearing something sacred. No, something sacred wears me. Reverses, like, who is the active party and who is more important? Well, the sacred garment could be more important than you in this sense, right? In this hierarchy. So, a man's garments, which is what we see here, these so-called war shirts, a man's garments would broadcast to everybody, they would communicate to everybody his rank in a kind of warrior community or warrior society. They would also communicate his individual military honors. I'm going to use a kind of silly example perhaps. But I don't know that much about this, but you think about the military. And maybe you know somebody in the military. Maybe you yourself are in the military. And in the military, they have uniforms. You wear the correct thing at the correct time, I guess. But on your uniform, there are also various elements, like stripes and other things that show up. Forgive my ignorance, please. But there are various symbols and stripes that you wear that show up on parts of your uniform that communicate to everybody where you are in the hierarchy, what you've earned. And you also wear medals sometimes that communicate the great deeds you have been part of, the honors you have accumulated because of your prowess, right? And so all of these, so I think about military uniforms. If you're familiar with that tradition, you can think about how there are these symbolic elements that communicate all of that stuff about people. This is a little bit like that, perhaps, right? Communicating that those things that an individual has earned and where they are in relation to other people in the warrior society. So it's an expression of yourself. It's an expression of your individuality. And this is one of the most important features of Plains culture, right? That awareness of who you are and that retelling of the things you've achieved, the things you've done, the things you've participated in. Your biography in that sense, but your biography in terms of socially valuable things that you retell and you not just acknowledge, you commemorate through, in part, your clothing, so that other people can identify those things and not reward, but honor you for these things. This is true for men and for women. In the case of shirts like this, what we have is a mixture of men's arts and women's arts. So you recognize, you can see the fringed buckskin, for example. So this is a hide garment. And the garment itself, especially the fringes, this is part of how men decorate their clothes. So you can see on the left, you have the shirt belonging to Red Cloud, who was of the Oglala Lakota. And you can see various forms of hair or fur woven into the fringes. Well, that's something that he would have done. But you also see these patches, not so much patches as these strips of beadwork and or quill work sometimes. And that's women's art. So what you have is these patches, these strips, I should say, of women's work that is now applied to the men's garment. So you have an overtly visual combination of men's work and women's work, of men's art and women's art coming together in a single garment. So I mentioned quill work, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but part of what I want to highlight is not just the skill of working in quills, but the way in which this was privileged and honored by so many plains peoples. Quill work was a sacred art form, and if a woman mastered it, it gave her social grace and it gave her prestige. Lakota women in particular teach that a supernatural figure known as Double Woman gave them the sacred art of quill work to a young woman in a dream, and this young woman taught it to other women. I want to use another example here. I don't know if you've heard of the idea of counting coup. Coup, C-O-U-P, right? Counting coup. This is a kind of quintessential men's practice in Plains warrior culture. And what it involves is getting really close to the enemy you're fighting and touching them, often with a coup stick or a baton, or a kind of special stick done for this purpose. And the point of this is in part to show how skilled you are physically, militarily, and to show off your finesse and also a kind of personal style. There's a boldness involved in this. You're getting right up close to your enemy saying, look, I got you. I touched you with my stick. I could have gotten you. If I had a weapon in my hand, you'd be goner. I'm that good. Right? And so counting coup is this quintessential men's process or practice with which they can acquire renown. The point is this. There's a Crow beadworker named Winona Plentyhoops from Montana, and she says, and I quote here, "A good design is like counting coup," unquote. So in other words, for a woman to undertake not just beadwork, which is, as you know, a sacred art, but to do it well, to create a good design, this brings her honor and respect in exactly parallel ways as a man can earn honor and respect by counting coup. On the plains, a woman's path to dignity, honor, and long life lay in the correct and skilled pursuit of the arts. Let us turn back to men's arts here. I already talked about vision quests briefly, and how on the bandolier bags in the woodlands, you had imagery taken from vision quests, and so that represent the spiritual power that individuals can acquire. Well, something similar is true on the plains. You have vision quests and dreams, and you have imagery that people then put on their belongings. Sorry, I'm not putting my words together very well, I guess. You've got here, for example, a war shield. This is a shield belonging to Arapush, of the Crow Nation. And it shows this skeletal figure of the moon spirit on his shield, holding a few different things. There's an eagle feathers, there's a deer's tail, right? You have it covered in red ochre, which is a powerful medicinal substance. So there's a lot of powerful medicine in this equipment here. But the point is that this imagery, this specific imagery, is unique to Arapush. It belongs to him, right? He has the ownership of the right to use this imagery. And this kind of thing these rights of imagery were strictly observed across the plains. But it is not only spiritual imagery that men put on their belongings, that men paint. There is also biography. I was just highlighting for you elements of military prowess, using the example of like U.S. military markings on uniforms, symbols on uniforms, as well as medals. Well, there's a powerful, super important sense of history for indigenous people in the Great Plains, which compelled the men to illustrate important events in their lives. You retell the story of the things you did, of the things you participated in, of historic events, of the honors you've earned and the great deeds that you undertook to earn those honors. This goes back, centuries, thousands of years perhaps, because we find rock paintings were used for a long time this way. Large-scale public rock paintings marking historical events and experiences coming from visions. You also have elements like we see here. That is to say, narrative scenes on robes. This is a robe. This is a garment. You wrap yourself in this robe, right? Clearly made of a buffalo hide. But it's painted with a whole series of figures that commemorate some important events in the life of this particular artist, who might have been Mandan, Sioux, or Yankton, we're not quite sure. So a man would make this, and he would paint this, and by wearing it, he's displaying his own personal history, and it's a way that he can reiterate and tell the story of his autobiography and great deeds. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you a close-up of this same image on the left. And part of what might stand out to us is the way in which human figures are rendered somewhat abstractly as sort of slightly elaborate stick figures, right? There is not a sense of the Euro-American representational tradition or the naturalism therein, right? It's not how the eye sees it, but there's a level of abstraction because the artist is focusing on essential figures and essential elements in order to tell a story. So you have to have all the basic elements of the story there. So after the Civil War in the 1860s, you had tremendous disruption and destruction of indigenous peoples' societies on the plains, because this is when settlement by Euro-Americans really expanded into the West. And indigenous people were forcibly resettled. Their traditional ways of life were fractured, especially for men. So by the late 19th century, it's hard to sort of continue those older traditions like I was just showing you. People ended up being forced to live on reservations and dependent on white people for much of the food they ate and materials for their clothing and shelter. And this is especially true because white folk, settlers, had hunted the buffalo almost to the brink of extinction, right? So the indigenous people couldn't rely on the buffalo in the way that they used to. But the culture doesn't die, it just changes shape. So men continued to record their deeds and record the changing way of life in paintings, sometimes on canvas, but also in what are called ledger drawings. So the way this worked is that, settlers would, come through, settlers would have these things like ledger books, which are these bound volumes with like lined paper in them, which are useful for making lists, right? So, okay, let's make a list of the inventory we have of our goods, or you have a ledger of like sales and records of selling your products. You're like a business person, you're buying up these things and you're selling to somebody else, profit, loss. You keep ledgers of these things. It's useful. And these books would sometimes be used by indigenous people, by indigenous men, to draw on in pencil, sometimes colored pencil, in place of painting, on buffalo hide. And there's an awful lot of images that document individual histories, individual stories, as well as changing way of life. Sometimes you wonder if some of these indigenous men were trying to document their way of life before they wanted to write it down visually before it got forgotten about. The most well-known of these ledger books come from drawings made by Cheyenne and Kiowa warriors who were imprisoned in 1875 to 1878 at Fort Marion in Florida, very far from their homelands. And part of what is happening is not only that they're drawing in ledger books, and sometimes it's just on paper, we call them ledger drawings even so, but they're also learning Euro-American pictorial conventions and beginning to draw in a more Euro-American, quote-unquote, realistic or naturalistic way. For example, we have this remarkable and very significant drawing by a man named Woha, who was Kiowa. And it's called Between Two Worlds. It shows that real powerful sense of ambivalence that folks must have felt. We have the figure of Woha. He's depicting himself in the middle there, and he's holding out peace pipes. He has a peace pipe in each hand, and he's holding them out to two sort of bovines. On our left, as we look on the left of the image, we see a buffalo, and he's holding out a peace pipe to a buffalo. This represents the traditional way of life, right? Because you see at Woha's foot, on the left of his body there, at the very bottom on the ground, right near his foot on the left, his right foot. Or to him, it would be his right foot. You see this little bunch of dots? That is a representation, a miniaturized representation of a herd of buffalo. Right next to that, you can see a teepee. You can see that sort of almost cylindrical shape with the sticks coming out of it. That's a teepee, right? So you've got, on the one side, the traditional nomadic following the buffalo way of life. On the right-hand side of the image, Woha is handing a peace pipe to a domestic cow, the kind that we still have on farms today. And his foot is literally standing in the plowed field of a farmer. And you can see the farmhouse right there next to his foot. So this is a powerful depiction, a compelling depiction of what it must have felt like to be in the middle of this deeply transformative period. Transformative for ill, for good or for ill, for both, I guess. Now, paradoxically, this late 19th century might have been a period of radical diminishment of men's arts. It actually became a period for tremendous richness of women's arts. It was an enormous elaboration of women's arts. So this partly, so if men can't hunt the buffalo and either go to war or count coup and do other kinds of military things on horseback the way they used to, if folks are forced to live on reservations, well, paradoxically, that gives women a lot more time to make their crafts, to make their art. So you have beadwork just blossoming absolutely. It's a kind of almost enforced leisure. They had time to devote to art because they didn't have they couldn't support themselves in the traditional ways anymore. And so women's arts came to symbolize the identity of the tribe for the peoples themselves and for outsiders, and became even more than before a way of affirming the traditions of the nation. I'm going to begin to wrap up here and show you this image. Oh no, I forgot to change my caption. Sorry, this is not an image of Between Two Worlds. I just forgot to change the caption here. What you have actually is on the right-hand side is a medicine wheel. These are large-scale earthworks, right? Where you use stones, you use rocks to build these patterns in the ground. This particular one that we see drawn on the right is the Bighorn medicine wheel from Wyoming, down on a mountain top, 9,600 feet elevation. It may have served to mark the summer solstice, other astronomical observations, in a way similar to what you will see in the documentary for this week, the sort of careful observation of astronomical events. The point is that you have medicine lodge enclosures and Sundance enclosures, structures, temporary structures, like this thing on the left, which is a Sundance enclosure. They're circular, and they're modeled on the medicine wheels. So you have this really ancient tradition going back at least 3,000 years, right, of the centrality of the circle. The giant pole, so if you look on the left-hand side there, the big pole, the big tree in the middle of the Sundance Lodge represents the axis at the center of the world around which the entire world, and in this case the entire ceremony, revolves. Right? You have this circle that is so important to them. The Sundance is a practice that brings together the entire community. There's these long and exhausting performances undertaken by young men, sometimes tied to this central pole. It's a very difficult physical endeavor that they undertake as a kind of sacrifice of their bodies to the community. Now, just like in the Pacific Northwest, when the potlatch was outlawed in the late 19th century, well, the Sundance was also outlawed. It was made illegal by the federal government in 1883, around the same time. And it would not be until 1978, nearly 100 years later, right? 1978 is within my lifetime, that different federal laws were passed that allowed the Sundance again, or that opened up the space for religious freedom to legally continue their traditional practices like the Sundance. As I said before, this was an effort to culturally assimilate, forcibly assimilate indigenous people. But we still have elements not just of continuation, not just of survivance. I mean, survivance is a big enough deal, but also this resilience by appropriation and adaptation. What I'm getting at is, some of the non-ceremonial, the non-spiritual parts of the Sundance would be continued by Indigenous people, even when this was illegal, but they would do it in other celebrations. They would adopt the 4th of July, a summer celebration, just like the Sundance was a summer celebration. And they would do, as non-spiritual, non-ceremonial aspects of the Sundance on 4th of July celebrations. So it's a kind of like, again, double signification. So you can imagine, settler colonial people being like, oh yeah, I guess they're being good Americans now. They're doing white people culture in all the good white people ways, but the Indigenous people are actually continuing parts of their traditional culture under the guise of the 4th of July. It is also in this period, in the later 19th through the 20th century, when the tradition of the powwow develops. Powwows are still very important things today, but it emerges through the 20th century. What a powwow is a kind of inter-tribal dance competition. You do the traditional dances and the traditional performances in a kind of competition with other folks who are not a part of your tribe. And it brings whole communities together from long distances, and this kept some of the traditional forms alive in this extremely harsh period of extremely harsh forced assimilation. You can see on the right hand here, this is a photographic portrait of a man, a Lakota man named Shoots the Crow, and you can see he's wearing that little tag that says he's number 1209 in the competition. This is a photograph from I think 40 years ago, maybe close to 40 years ago, and he's competing at a powwow, and you can see he's got all the garments on, he's got all the costume, right? And it's impressive. It is really visually impressive. But you think also about how much time it took, right? The kind of labor of love here to make all of these traditional headdresses and shirts and leggings in all the traditional ways to perform in these competitions, right? And today, the Sundance is still practiced as an enduring symbol of traditional values and ideals. So with that, we come to the end. Here is the agenda that we just covered. I talked about a little bit of stuff at the beginning of the first lecture. I talked about some key concepts. Just wanted to highlight those again. I want to bang on those. Adaptation and appropriation, which you've just seen show up again and again. And we looked at 3 examples of Indigenous cultures, broad areas. We started with the Pacific Northwest, we moved to the woodlands on the east, and then just finished up now by looking at the Great Plains. And I feel like we saw not just some of the particulars, but also some of the larger patterns that reveal the use of adaptation, appropriation, as part of this process of cultural resilience and cultural change that's led to the survival and survivance of Indigenous nations. And along the way, I hope we've challenged some of the colonial ideas that, that you probably grew up with, that you learned without realizing you learned them. And so, thank you for your time. I will see you again next week. Bye-bye.